Hey guys, today's story is about the man, the myth, the legend. Todd. So before I go into this story, I should describe myself. I got started playing D&D and other tabletop RPGs in college, and I was immediately hooked. The main thing I saw in these campaigns is that they were oftentimes written to fit certain shows, games, or any specific franchise. This ranged from Avatar: The Last Airbender to Men in Black to Welcome to Night Vale. This is how I became the reference-loving DM I am today. Oftentimes my campaigns were either directly from a show or game, or they had several references to different things all over the place. Stuff like Alien, Monster Hunter, Attack on Titan, Cube, Futurama, you name it. That being said, I've had my fair share of creating or using homebrew mechanics in tandem with using an established system. I should also mention that while I do throw decent challenges at my players, for example throwing 3 red slots and 10 tadpoles in rough terrain at your level 3 players, I'm also a big softie and love spoiling my players. I'm talking making brand new and totally overpowered items, or even just allowing them to take a proficiency in some feat that isn't aligned with their class because it matches their backstory. Just tell me what you want, and most of the time, if it's reasonable, I will give it to you. The bottom line is that you're with me to have fun, so I'll make sure of it. But that doesn't mean I'll let you push me around either. I learned that the hard way. And that brings me to that one guy that taught me how to have a backbone, and how not to take crap from my players. This is the story of how this one guy that ruined a birthday one-shot planned just for me, as well as him killing a campaign with an intricately created homebrew system that I had been desperate to try out after months of writing it. Let's call this guy Todd. Todd was a friend of my other regular D&D buddies, but they certainly had their fair share of problems with him too. He was loud and foul-mouthed, in such a way that it was obnoxious. Don't get me wrong, my friends and I curse all the time too, but not like him. And on top of that, he was incredibly hostile, and overbearing when playing games in general, not just D&D. He would often get mad in any games he was losing, and would start to whine, complain, and throw around harsh and definitely unwarranted insults towards the person that slighted him. Despite this, I considered him a friend and included him where I could in our D&D goings-on. Such was the first case with a birthday of mine. I had asked one of my best friends to DM a one-shot for my birthday, and he agreed. I was so excited because, 1, he always comes up with the best stories and encounters, and 2, I was going to try out the druid class for the first time. I made the mistake of talking about these plans around Todd, who seemed excited and interested. This is when I stupidly invited him into the one-shot, much to everyone else's horror. They later that day told me how bad of an idea it was to invite Todd, but I felt that we should at least give him the benefit of the doubt. And holy God was I wrong, because it all spiraled down from there. I had everyone come over to my apartment, including Todd. That was my first mistake. Since it was my birthday, we were all going to be drunk this D&D session. This meant that none of us were going to be taking it seriously. Unfortunately, Todd did. We came up with these ridiculous level 10 characters that we loved. And I'll admit that at first, Todd's character was actually pretty great as well. There was a monk who was inside a rolling iron ball. Think like a hamster in a hamster ball. And no one ever saw what was in the ball. We had a human ex-town guard turned wild magic sorcerer, who kept spouting nonsense. It was heavily implied he was let go from his guard job because of insanity, but we were too afraid to ask him. I was a wood elf druid who carried about 30 small potted plants on my person in order to cast my spells. including a 4-foot-tall potted shrub strapped onto my back, who I claimed was my brother. The DM allowed me to do this, as I soon learned, much to our amusement, that our one-shot would be on a ship in the middle of the ocean. Technically, I was the only healer of the party, although that's not the style of play I was intending to focus on. Most everyone was fine with this because it was a silly one-shot. Except Todd, who I would discover much later was not okay with it. Finally, Todd's character was a Minotaur cowboy barbarian. Of course, his character was loud, boisterous, southern, and he made dang well sure he was the main DPS of the group. I can't remember everything about that game because of the booze, but ultimately I remember it was a fun time, sans Todd. There were several encounters with Zflocco, and we used our characters liberally with no holds back. It was pretty awesome. That was until Todd would take his turn. His character would get angry and challenge the other players if one of them got a hit in that did more damage than his attacks. He would become a show-off and demanded that the DM describe the kills in the most gore-filled ways. While in his turn, he was able to hit 2-3 enemies because of his multi-attacks, this still was not enough. The casters would get wider ranges, hit more targets, and Todd would get even angrier. After each battle, he would spout off how great he was until no one would listen. We laughed it off, drank, and enjoyed ourselves, but Todd seemed to be upset by the lack of attention. Along with this, Todd would interrupt other players with his own terrible ideas, and try to make himself the center of attention. When we didn't go with his ideas, he of course became even angrier. Then came the final battle, which we were being swarmed and cornered on our ship by kobolds and Zflocco. Everyone hid in barrels or behind other objects, but my character unfortunately wasn't fast enough to grab one of those hiding spaces before they were completely filled. This is when, in my drunken haze, I made an honestly stupid, yet hilarious idea. If I couldn't have a barrel or a spot behind our freight, then I would hide in the shrub. The DM looked at me funny.
The shrub is only 4 feet tall, and you're 5'4",
he told me.
Well, can't a shrub technically be a small tree?
He thought for a moment, and he answered, "Sure." And that's when I announced my plan. I told him I would blow my 5th level spell slot to use Tree Stride, and hide in the trunk of my small tree. Granted, it wasn't how the spell was supposed to be used, but mostly everyone laughed at the idea. All except for Todd, who grumbled about how stupid it was. While I would have normally agreed with him in a normal campaign, this was a drunken one-shot, so ultimately no one was taking this seriously. My DM laughed and shrugged, allowing it because it was amusing. Hilariously, my surprise attack out of the bush wasn't effective at all. But our party brushed it off and began combat. We were doing well for a bit, having a fun time until our rolls started to turn a little unlucky. The kobolds and Zflocco were swarming us in growing numbers. The monk, the sorcerer, and myself took the most damage, starting to get below 15 health from our original starting point of about 60 to 80 HP. Meanwhile, Todd's character, who started at about 95 HP, was just starting to get through half of his HP into the 40s. Guess who complained the loudest? This combat session took almost 3 hours. At that point, my buzz was starting to wear off, and I was quickly running out of spell slots. I used one of my last remaining spell slots to heal the group for about 10 HP. But that was all I could really do. After another round of combat and taking some minuscule damage, Todd began to hassle me directly, yelling,
"Why aren't you healing me?"
To which I told him I couldn't, because I didn't have the spell slots for it. He got angry with me, and he got passive-aggressive after that. Everyone else was worse off and not complaining, yet he continued to moan and wail about how he wasn't being healed. It was either,
"Oh, if only someone could heal me,"
or
Boy, I'm taking so much damage.
at one point, I started to quietly beg the DM for my 5th level spell slot back, embarrassingly saying that the tree stride was a bad idea. No one else spoke up at the awkward scene. But Todd, of course, roared once again about how it was the stupidest move he had ever heard of. While I do love my DM friend, he unfortunately didn't give me my spell slots back. At that point, I mentally checked out of the game, and my DM noticed. I can't remember how it ended, but we ended up defeating all the enemies and sailing off into the distance for a birthday party. Todd was jovial and happy, while I sat there quiet and mortified over getting yelled at for wanting to joke around and have fun. Outside of the actual session, Todd also did several things that just made us regret having him there. He was especially foul-mouthed that evening, which the neighbors on the other side of our very thin walls angrily let us know the next day. Along with that, he was getting way too close to my fiancé, invading his personal space by leaning over him, getting in his face, and scooting into him several times over the course of the night. He also kept grabbing at my cat, who tried to get away from him. Todd wouldn't allow it, and I watched my cat drag her claws across the floor trying to find anything to grab onto just to prevent him from picking her up. My fiancé asked him to stop several times, but he just kept doing it. Finally, right before the session started, Todd went to the bathroom and came out in pajamas. No one was going to be spending the night at my apartment, so why was he in pajamas? Needless to say, I learned the hard way that my friends had been right about it not being a good idea to include him. I should have learned that on that day, but unfortunately, I didn't. The next time I spoke with him was a week or two later. We happened to be in the same Discord lobby playing video games, and I had been in the middle pitching an idea for my next campaign to my friends when he joined in the voice chat. I was working on a Monster Hunter World themed game, one that I had spent months trying to write out a homebrew system for. I wanted desperately to test it out, and figured who better to ask than my regular D&D buddies who were also DMs. Maybe I could get some feedback and pointers. In my system, you could build weapons with specific abilities, armor that gave you buffs and resistance, have a palico as a sidekick, pick up items to craft potions and buffing items, the whole works from Monster Hunter. I had devised a smaller system from the D&D 5e system in which the players were supposed to pick one of 5 certain classes, no magic users, a certain weapon from the guide I was using, and one of only 4 races. I was incredibly proud of all the work I did, to say the least. After pitching this idea, Todd of course spoke up about how he was interested, and told me how he wanted to join. I should have told him no, but I didn't have the heart to. I gathered about 5 players in total, told everyone the rules, directed them to the step-by-step guide on how to build their characters, and after a little less than a month from then, we had our first session. For those who didn't know about the mechanics of the Monster Hunter games, I'll briefly go over my plot and some rules that I set out for my players. First, in regard to the plot, the players all had to start off as students, ready to graduate from the Estera Monster Hunter Academy. Their last objective, to guide younger students in the field to show them the ropes of hunting. I told them this, and they all agreed. Second, the players could build up their weapons and armor in specific ways by hunting specific monsters. For example, if you wanted resistance to paralysis for your armor, then you would request to hunt a monster called the Great Gyros. In fact, I gave the players a list of lower-tier monsters from the game that they could use as their first set of armor. Each armor either had 1 or 2 abilities and or buffs that the players could get. For example, your armor could have provided faster speed, resistance to certain damage types, increased elemental damage, etc. After each hunt, I would roll up what parts they got from carving up the monster. and give them plenty of resources for all players to use as they wished in order for customizing their armor and weapons. Their hunts were meant to inspire teamwork, so they all understood that resources were communal and they all had to do their fair share of work. I thoroughly went over all the rules and guidelines, and it seemed as if everyone was in agreement. Or so I thought. So the day arrived and the first session began. Everyone introduced their characters, and I asked who wanted to go first. And, of course, Todd spoke up.
My character's name is Nori. I have a wife and about 20 kids. I wield a mighty and powerful gun lance. I'm basically a Scotsman in that I only wear my kilt.
I immediately speak up. You don't want to wear your armor?
No, a man of my caliber doesn't need armor.
Okay, but you won't get the benefits of wearing the armor, I said.
Why not?
I sighed. After hearing him go off about how he should be able to wear what he wants, I caved and told him he could have the benefits and wear the kilt only. Despite winning and getting his way, he was still mad at me for trying to have him fit the narrative. He brushed it off and continued with his intro.
I'm a professor at Asteric Academy. A professor on how to murder.
I thought he was joking, and laughed. Ha ha, yeah. You're a self-appointed teacher on how to kill things.
No, I'm an actual teacher.
At this point, I stepped in again to moderate. No. I explained that you're all starting out as students. You're all on the same level. No teachers. He went into a fit hearing this, spitting at me about how it's not fair to limit his backstory, and how he should be able to make whatever character that he wants. At this point, I was getting uncomfortable, and one of the players, who is an absolute saint and a good friend, spoke up to him and put him in his place. She told him that it was the DM's call, and that as a player, he needed to respect that. The other players voiced their agreements, which of course made him mad as a hornet. After that, I asked him nicely if he wanted to continue with his character's intro, and he aggressively told me no. And he played the quiet game for about 30 minutes or so after that. I shrugged it off and moved through the other character intros, and proceeded to start the session's plot. He only spoke up once during those 30 minutes, openly complaining to everyone about how he was supposed to be the main DPS, when another player explained how her character was using a hammer as her weapon. A weapon that's honestly on par with the gun lance in the actual games. He quieted down again, and the group began their quest by exploring the map I provided them. The Academy had given them a goal to hunt the Great Jagras to demonstrate to the newer students that were shadowing the group. At this point, Todd started to speak up again, and his character took a liking to one of the kids that seemed the most like him. He told me that his character gave the student a spare baby's first gun lance that he just so happened to have. I tried to laugh and say no, but this time he just blatantly ignored me.
No, I'm still going to give them their first gun lance.
I sighed and said, "You can't do that. You can't have more than one weapon on your person."
No, I have 20 kids, so it makes sense that I have an extra tiny gun lance. I give it to him.
I took a moment to compose myself, sighed, and caved yet again. Anything to shut him up, and just move on with the plot. The party continued exploring, traversing rough terrain while tracking the monster, and eventually they came across a shallow river with mossy stones. Everyone made dex checks for the rough terrain, and everyone made it, except for him. He rolled a nat 1. I told him that his character slipped and fell face first into the river, smacking his nose and taking 1d4 of damage. My players laughed, and one of them making a comment that I honestly don't remember. Todd flew into a rage.
Shut the heck up!
He yelled, followed by an awkward silence from everyone. We moved on the best we could, trying to forget what just happened. That's when they finally found the Great Jagras, laying around with a bunch of the minor Jagrases. The players huddled, wanting to devise a plan to sneak up on the monster. Nope, Todd doesn't allow it. He proudly exclaims that he charges at the Great Jagras, much to the exasperation of the other players. So I start the initiative order, and unfortunately, Todd rolls low on the order, so he's one of the last players to go. There is one Great Jagras and about 10 minor Jagrases, and they quickly work together to designate who takes on which monsters. Not Todd, though. He insists that his character sets his sight on the Great Jagras. And the combat went fairly well, except for the few times Todd didn't hit the Great Jagras. His failed attacks often resulted in loud complaining and demands that the others go faster so he could take his next turn. Admittedly, he did do the most damage, but I was so sick of his complaining, I modified the Great Jagras to have 20 less HP mid-combat, just so we could get the session over with. Todd, of course, got the final blow on the monster, and he told me to describe it in the most brutal way possible. I sigh. As the Great Jagras makes one final roar, you take your gun lance and jab it right into his mouth. You fire off one blast and...
No, that's not what I do. I take my lance and shove it through him all the way from his butt to his mouth.
Everyone was disgusted, but I was beyond done with him at that point, and I just went along with it. Anything to make the session end earlier. With the end of the session, I tried to cheerfully congratulate everyone on a successful hunt. I started to tell them what parts they carved from the monster, when Todd once again interrupted.
No, I did most of the work. I'm taking the body home and stuffing it so that I can decorate my living room.
At this point, I had it, and I told him no. It was a team effort, and that the main loot came from the monster parts. Everyone deserved to share in the reward for their hard work. He argued against me, saying he deserved it more, but I put my foot down and told him that this campaign wasn't going to be all about him. With that, he was done, and he hung up on all of us. With that final awkward note, the session ended there, and with it, the campaign. Todd's attitude had killed the enthusiasm to play the game again. After spending a week torn up over what to do, I remorsefully made the decision to close the campaign and try again at some other point in time, and I haven't touched it since then. I tried to move past it the best I could, and remained cordial with Todd since he was also friends with other friends. However, the straw that broke the camel's back happened about a week later. I had been talking about my campaign with two friends, one of them being the DM who ran my birthday one-shot. After telling them about what Todd did, the DM friend spoke up. Apparently, Todd had messaged him shortly after my session, apparently complaining about how bad of a DM I was. He told my friend that I wasn't letting him have his way with his backstory, that I chose terrible players, and I did nothing but laugh at him, and made him feel like he didn't do any of the hard work. My second friend spoke up as well, and this is where I turned livid. Todd complained to him during my campaign, immediately messaging my second friend when I wouldn't let him be a professor of murder. With that, I cut ties with Todd, blocked him on social media and Discord, kicked him from any and all servers that he was on, and refused to speak with him again. Last I heard, he was confused as to why I was mad, and then got mad himself and called me a jerk to my friends. My other friends slowly but surely stopped hanging around him, all coming to the conclusion that he just wasn't worth the trouble of having to deal with his complaining. With this, I learned my lesson. I'm now able to watch for warning signs and act before it gets worse. I will say that dealing with Todd has allowed me to become a much better DM with dealing with problematic players. So, at least, something good came out of it. Take this story as a warning, and watch out for players like Todd. But in any case, guys, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have a story that you'd like me to narrate, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching, and have a good one.